So today we're going to start talking about political parties, and we're going to look at how they developed. And in America, we're very used to a two-party system. We have the Republicans and we have Democrats. And we don't really have more than two major primary parties. That's not true for other countries. For example, Great Britain, they've got three. They've got the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democratic Party. But America has developed around two central parties, and that's what we want to look at today. Now, we do want to talk that politics has always been very divisive. A lot of people like to look at today's Congress and Republicans and Democrats today and say this is the most divisive America has ever been, and they're just too far apart and can't get along. But looking back into history, we find that people have differences of opinions, and they've always had differences of opinions, and it can get pretty ugly. For example, this picture is of a fight that broke out on the Congress floor, and they came to blows. You've got Representative Matthew with fire pokers in his hands, and Representative Griswold of Connecticut wielding a club. So even all the way back to George Washington, politics produces strong feelings on both sides of the aisle. And I don't see today the divisiveness that led to the vice president, who's going to be Aaron Burr, killing the opposition party of Alexander Hamilton in a duel. So you have strong feelings on both sides. And it started underneath George Washington. Now, George Washington is actually going to, in his farewell address, plead for no political parties. He doesn't want people to be divisive. He wants everyone to work together, and he has sort of this idealistic view. And he saw these political factions developing underneath his presidency, and he was sort of warning against political parties. He says, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more full and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty." So Jefferson warns against political parties, fearing that one person would come into power with the backing of his supporters, and then he could become could become a despot or a ruler, and not really the will of the people. So Washington very much wanted people to work together. However, underneath Washington, we're going to see political parties develop, and we've already sort of seen this with the division between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Remember the division between, well, what is the role of the federal government? Should the federal government have more power, or should the states have more power? So we've already seen people with differences of opinions emerging. Now, the leader of the Federalists is going to be a man named Alexander Hamilton, and he was Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, and he's going to be a strong proponent of the federal or national bank. So these are some of the things that Hamilton believed and the Federalists believed. Of course, he wrote the Federalist Papers, and he was father of the Constitution. He believed in a manufacturing-based society. Now, what that means is that he believed that the United States should work to build factories and export goods, and that would make America great if they became a nation that traded and exported. He was a loose constructionist. Now, that talks about how he viewed the Constitution. He viewed the Constitution as sort of a living document that would adopt and change, and it didn't really mean that it could only be restrained to what was written. And we'll see the opposite of that in a strict constructionist. He's considered the father of the national bank system. And he's going to favor England over France in foreign policy. So these are the things he believed and his party believed, and we're going to look at these in depth, each individual thing further. But let's look at the leader of the other side, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson is going to become the leader of the Democratic Republicans. We know that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He's the third president of the United States, and he's going to believe in an agrarian society. So, of course, that's very much different than a manufacturing society. He believed in sort of more of America being isolationist, that if they farmed and self-sufficient, they wouldn't have to be involved with any other countries, that they could just farm and sustain themselves. And you can think of that when you think of Monticello and his large plantations. He wanted all of America to sort of be like that. Now, he was a strict constructionist. Now, a strict constructionist looks at the Constitution and says, it says this, and that's all we can do. The government cannot take more power than what is directly written in the Constitution. So he's going to be against a national bank because the Constitution doesn't say you can create a national bank. Of course, he purchased the Louisiana Purchase, which is what a lot of students remember him for. He's going to favor France over Great Britain, and that becomes important in foreign policy. So let's look at the parties. We've got the Federalists under Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson. Let's look at what they believe on key issues. For example, economics. Of course, Hamilton, being a Federalist, wants a strong federal government, and he believes that he can do that by strengthening the power of the government by assuming state debt. Now, what do I mean by this? States accrued huge amounts of debt during the American Revolution. And Hamilton believed that if the national government assumed that debt, then they would have more power. Now, Northerners, who still had a lot of their debt, were very happy for the government to take that over. Southerners had paid off a lot of their debt, so they didn't really see a benefit to this. So they compromised. So you had the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans. They came to an agreement that the government could take over the debt. They moved the capital closer to the south. So that's how we actually get Washington, D.C. to be further south. So they did reach a compromise. Now, what about the bank? Now, before, there wasn't a bank. Remember, the states had separate currencies. Everything was very much localized within the states. And Hamilton's going to use what's called the elastic clause and a loose interpretation of the Constitution to say that it is necessary and proper for the federal government to form a bank. And he does this. This is the elastic clause. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. And the Federalists are going to really like this clause because they're going to see that where it says necessary and proper as a way to apply to a lot of different things. Whereas the Democratic Republicans say, but it's not written. It doesn't explicitly say to do this. But the Federalists are going to say, oh, but yes, it's necessary and proper. And this becomes known as the elastic clause. And you do need to know that this is the elastic clause and what it does. And it expands the power of the federal government. So because it's necessary and proper, Hamilton's going to establish a national bank. Because you need national currency, you need to regulate trade, etc. So the strict constructionists, or the Democratic or Republicans, are going to be against it. Washington's going to pass it anyway, and we have the first bank of the United States. And it's very important to understand this argument between Federalists and Democratic Republicans over Hamilton's economic policies and the bank. It's very important. So let's look at taxes. Taxes, of course, are always an issue. Even today we talk about taxes and we disagree over taxes. Well, they disagreed back then too. So Hamilton, who's a Federalist, wants to, again, strengthen the national government, so he needs money. And he wants to raise money for the national government, so he decides to tax. And what he decides to tax is whiskey. And, of course, Jefferson, remember, he's the agrarian. He doesn't support this because he feels like it's unfair. It hurts farmers because the farmers take their corn and turn it into whiskey. And back then, roads were not very, so you couldn't take just raw corn across the mountains. It would rot. And so they only made money when they turned their corn into whiskey. And so Jefferson felt that this was, of course, an unfair tax against farmers. In the back country, farmers are going to start a rebellion, and it's called the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is important because Washington is actually going to send in troops and say that you can't ignore a federal law. And if you can see this, this is a picture of farmers refusing to pay taxes. This is the tax man, and they're burning his house, and they've tarred and feathered him. And if you remember images from the Revolutionary War where they had the British officer and the British officer was being tarred and feathered, it's very similar to that. So you can see that this is this difference of opinion over taxes is actually almost could spark a civil war, because you've got people who don't want to obey the federal government tar and feathering the officials. But Washington comes in and puts out the rebellion. So let's look at foreign policy. So we talked about how Hamilton supported Great Britain, and he did this because we already had a relationship with Great Britain. Jefferson, of course, is going to favor France. Now, France is going through the French Revolution, and the French Revolution put out a document called the Declaration of Man and Citizens, and it was very similar to the Declaration of Independence. And, of course, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson. So he's more inclined to side with the French, because obviously we fought a war against Britain. He's afraid, hey, we don't necessarily want to get in cozy with somebody we just fought a war with. The French had actually helped us during the Revolutionary War, so he supports that as well. That's one reason he supports the French as well. So we want to look specifically at the foreign policy underneath John Adams. Now, Adams was a Federalist. We want to look at the Jeanette Affair, the Jay Treaty, and the XYZ Affair. These are the foreign policy things that you need to know. You don't need to know the details, but what they led to, because one leads to another. And we're going to look at the Jeanette Affair because during the French Revolution, and France is also fighting Great Britain, and they come to America and are seeking our support in their fight against Great Britain, and we don't give it. So that pushes us a little bit away from France, and then with the Jay Treaty, we're trying to solve some problems that were not resolved at the end of the American Revolution. And we end up signing the Jay Treaty. Now, the Jay Treaty is not very popular back home, but it does give us greater trading status with Great Britain. So this then, of course, leads us to the XYZ Affair. And the XYZ Affair is basically a confrontation between the United States and France. We sent ambassadors to France to sort of resolve issues that could have led to war. And the French sent ambassadors who were nicknamed X, Y, and Z. And they demanded loans and bribes from the United States. And we took offense to that and returned home and didn't resolve anything. This resulted in a quasi-war with France. It was never a declared war. We had some naval battles. But what the XYZ Affair did was it did lead Adams to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts basically were laws that restricted the freedoms of Americans during this time of unrest. They weren't allowed to protest the government. There was no freedom of the press. They especially had a hard policy against immigrants because they felt that they may be French spies or working for the French government in the United States. They said they were dangerous to the peace of the U.S. the civil liberties parts, the freedom of speech and freedom of press, they said that it was for national security. So what they did was Jefferson, who of course is prone to like the French, and of course he sees this as a gross overstep by the government. They go to the states and they begin passing laws in the state legislatures that say that federal laws are null and void and don't apply. And that's going to become important later. Sort of the states overruling federal law. So in the election of 1800, it was between Thomas Jefferson and the incumbent John Adams. And it really was the two parties deciding whether they wanted to stick with the Federalists and the strong central government, or go with Jefferson and his more less government Democratic Republicans. And of course, they had some problems with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and of course, the immigrants were strongly in favor of Jefferson. But it was an extraordinarily tight race, and you can read about the election itself. But basically, there were 36 ballots done, and Jefferson was finally elected. And with his election, it sort of was the days of the Federalist Party. They're going to lose a lot of power. A very interesting situation that arises, and again can show the divisiveness of the parties, was between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Alexander Hamilton, of course, was Secretary of the Treasury under Washington, and Aaron Burr was Jefferson's vice president. There was a lot of animosity between them over politics, and at some point, Hamilton says something to defame Burr's character, and Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel. So these two very prominent politicians go out and they have a duel, and Burr shoots Hamilton. Hamilton later dies. Burr is sort of on the run, but he eventually is arrested and tried for murder. So you can see, like, politics is a dirty business, even way back then. So what you want to remember, we're going to sort of summarize everything that we've talked about. You definitely need to know Hamilton and his Federalists and what they believed, and I sort of summarized them. And then, of course, the Democratic Republicans, which would be Jefferson and Madison, and then I summarized what they believed. We want to include in this particular lesson information on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did not have a lot of power when it was created. There wasn't a lot written in the Constitution about what its role should be, so it was pretty weak. But under Adams, you're going to have a judge elected named John Marshall, and John Marshall is going to do amazing things for the court. He's going to extremely expand and strengthen the Supreme Court. Now, he's a Federalist, and he's going to serve for 30 years. And he's definitely going to support a strong central government. The key case that you want to understand is Marbury versus Madison. And in Marbury versus Madison, it has to do with a judge that didn't get his appointment, and it's actually pretty complicated. I'm going to try to summarize it in as easy a way as I can. So the president won't elect Marbury as a judge, okay? So Congress gets involved and says that the Supreme Court can pass and elect Marbury as a judge. So Congress is basically passing this law that says, or passing it off to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court knows that if they sign this letter saying that Marbury can become a judge, that will go to the president, and the president's going to ignore it. And so that makes the Supreme Court weak. So what does Marbury do? Marbury goes to the Constitution, and he starts looking for a way, that basically a loophole, that he doesn't have to issue this letter and look like a weak court. And he finds that the Constitution never says that Congress can give the Supreme Court that power. So what he says is that it is null and void. And this sets the precedent for what's called judicial review. And it basically says that the Supreme Court can look at a law and determine if that law is constitutional. And if that law is not constitutional, then they can declare it null and void. So you need to be very familiar with what judicial review is, that it started with the Marbury versus Madison case, but is used continually even to this day. We're going to see it come up again and again in U.S. history. Roe v. Wade, they passed that it was legal to have an abortion, and it's going to go before the Supreme Court and be battled out in the Supreme Court whether that's actually a constitutional law. Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, was passed by Congress, signed by the president, but it went before the Supreme Court and it was challenged. Is the Affordable Care Act constitutional? Just last week, a Hobby Lobby case, as a provision in a law that was passed, they brought it before the Supreme Court and said, is this portion of the law constitutional? So the power of the Supreme Court was greatly expanded underneath John Marshall. So the John Marshall did two things. He expanded the court's power, and he always strengthened the federal power, the power of the federal government. And that's important because that continues to this day to be sort of what the court does. These are cases that you need to be familiar with that were part of John Marshall's rulings: Gibson versus Ogden, McCulloch versus Maryland, Worcester versus Georgia, Dartmouth versus Woodward. You don't need to know the details, and if you want to know the details, they're pretty interesting, but you do need to know if they come up on a test, oh, these are John Marshall Court rulings, they strengthen the courts and strengthen the federal power. There are a lot of different rabbit trails that you could go off on in this lesson. Of course, political parties are fascinating, but this is what you need to know for U.S. history and the end of course exam.